Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the new underground hip-hop album from LMNO and Evidence, called After the Fact. Now, some of you who have been following my reviews are probably wondering why, in comparison with most mainstream music critics, I don't tend to cover a huge amount of hip-hop or rap music that is outside of the major releases, and sometimes not even including those. I don't always tend to hit up every single mixtape or underground album that gets dropped either. Believe it or not, I do have a reason for this. I don't have time. I'm working a full-time 8-hour job here, plus doing these videos, and given that I want to cover other genres besides hip-hop and rap, I just don't have the time to cover everything that gets put out. If I chose to dedicate myself to just covering hip-hop and rap, I would have arguably a better chance of tackling most of these albums, but I bet I'd still be absolutely swamped. But here's the other kind of unfortunate fact, and that is I'm kind of getting tired of the direction that most modern rap is taking. I've mentioned in previous videos that I don't think trap instrumentation is really a good fit for modern rap music, how the dour, humorless, often kind of creepy beats are just a bad tonal fit for brag rapping, and much to my frustration, they don't seem to be going away. And sure, while the retro kind of late 80s Beastie Boys-esque direction that Eminem appears to be going in looks intriguing and I'm cautiously optimistic, I'm also very much aware that the Marshall Mathers LP 2 will likely never ever live up to the high expectations that Eminem is trying to create. Look, I'm an optimist here, but the Marshall Mathers LP was a classic and trying to recreate that, So, look, it was perhaps the best possible time for me to go back into the underground and check out the newest album from LMNO, a very prolific white rapper from Long Beach, signed to Up Above Records from the hip-hop crew The Visionaries. Now, LMNO has been around since the mid-90s, and he's released a ton of material over the past several years, particularly in 2010, where he dropped 10 albums. And while I highly doubt all 10 of the albums were incredibly solid, it does point to a rapper that has a lot of experience and who has refined his flow into something truly potent. It also shows that he's a rapper with something to say, and he needs to take 10 albums to say all, but that's implying a lot. So, teaming up with producer Evidence, he released After the Fact this year after taking 2012 off. And on a recommendation from a fan, I decided to take a look. So, what do I think? Well, quite frankly, it's great. It's exactly what I needed coming out of the past few weeks. A surge of excellently produced, well-structured rapping that actually bothers to be about something and occasionally, has something to say. It was a huge breath of fresh air, and I'm really glad that I got a chance to check this album out. And while I'm not quite sure it's going to land on my top 10 list of the year, it's definitely a strong contender. Now let's start with the element that immediately got a huge sigh of relief from me, and that's the production. Dear God, the production on After the Fact is goddamn fantastic, with each track showing signs of real grit and texture that I really appreciated. Not to state the obvious, but it sounds like it was lifted straight from the underground. The mid to late 90s underground in particular, with record scratches and rich, expansive, sample-heavy soundscapes that sound like they were recorded on location, which adds a lot to the authenticity of the tracks. And what's best about all of it is that the production lets all of these elements blend together seamlessly into an interesting, well-composed whole. I've said in the past that the best possible production is that which is not even noticeable, but given how many albums I've reviewed recently with mediocre to disastrous production, it's a welcome shift that's organic and was clearly fitted together with a lot of professionalism and skill. Somebody put a lot of effort into the production of this album, and it definitely shows. And on top of that, the instrumentation is solid as hell as well. As I said, it's a refreshingly old school album, possibly even a throwback, but it's the kind of throwback that works and shows why all these elements really work in the right context. The instrumentation of this album is often rooted in catchy acoustic instrumentation or these fuzz-saturated samples, with the beats being simple and yet distinctive enough to give each track its own distinctive feeling and atmosphere. Hell, even Long Range, the track that seems to be the closest thing this album gets to modern style instrumentation, well, it's well structured enough not to sound generic, and unlike most modern instrumentation in modern rap, it matches the content of the lyrics. There are songs on this album that remind me a lot of mid to late 90s production from Dr. Dre, and that's a high compliment to Evidence, who put these instrumentals together. Now, if I were to register something of a complaint, I would say that the squealing sound at the top of the mix on March Madness was a little unnecessarily grating, but that's one song. But a larger issue comes up not with momentum per se, because this album has a surprising amount of album momentum throughout the tracks, but in the instrumental energy of this album. While it does match LMNO's delivery quite well, I'd argue that the album, despite being a slow burn, doesn't really quite reach a climax, or a point where the instrumentation really ratchets it up a notch. It's very solid, don't get me wrong, and there are moments where the instrumentation is easily the best part of the song on tracks like No Risk, No Reward, and especially the correction. But if there's a payoff to that slow burn, it's very muted at best, and thus left me feeling, well, a little cold at the end of the album. But really, those are minor issues. So let's talk about LMNO himself and his rhymes. And, I'll say it right now. This is what rap lyrics should look like. Multi-syllabic rhyme schemes, each lyric flowing naturally into the next one. Precise, well-composed poetry, and the skill to load every single song with multiple memorable punchlines. You can tell there was a lot of thought and effort put into each line of this album. And man, that's refreshing to see. On top of that, it feels original, as LMNO delivers his lyrics with the skill and ease of a professional rapper, and all of his guest stars deliver as well. This is the sort of rapping we only saw in the mainstream for a brief time, and man, I miss it. And while I wouldn't say that the topics of the rapping are all that different from what is common in the underground, there's a lot of nuance throughout this album that I really dug throughout these lyrics that support the central theme of this album in an excellent way. The album's title could also double as the theme of the album. It's an album looking backwards, filled with reflexive hindsight and an impressive lack of rose-colored nostalgia. Take songs like Yearbook, where LMNO reflects upon formative events in his school years, supported by this melancholy chorus and this ambiance that seems to capture every moment anybody sits down and cracks open a yearbook with friends to reminisce. What also seems to be apparent on this album is a fair amount of simmering bitterness against the direction that modern hip-hop has taken. But it never quite really explodes into rage, but definitely manifests as a certain disgust for the simplification and dumbing down of the modern rap scene. But even more than that, it's also an album that takes a fair amount of stock in how modern society has seemed to evolve and devolve, both economically and socially. These are comments that talk about the conditions of the unemployed, or talk about how people feel that they're beaten down, or the disconnects that form in relationships these days, from the phone call transition to the text message. Not exactly condemning it per se, but not really praising it by any stretch of the mind either. These are lyrics that actually have something to say, in the correct framing to say it very well, which makes this album incredibly immersive and only enhances the texture and feel of the tracks, giving them a significant amount of weight and potence. Now, the one track I'd like to point out, which is one of the lead singles, is Dyslexia, which is a track that frames both the struggles of one dealing with dyslexia, but also fuses it with wordplay that shows how one's reading of dyslexic lyrics might be interpreted in an alternate way. It's a really interesting theme, and I'd like to point it out as something that you don't often see in rap music. So, with all that in mind, what are the real problems with this album? Well, I've got two of them that spring to mind. The first is LMNO's delivery. Make no mistake, it's not bad and does match the mood presented by the instrumentation very well, but it's also rather low-key. It doesn't really build or escalate too much, and thus it feels a little calculated, not quite as organic or emotionally driven as it could be, which I think could have made LMNO's message hit a little bit harder. On top of that, while this album does have a really good flow from track to track, there is a lack of truly meaty, gripping hooks throughout the album, particularly on the second half. Now, look, don't get me wrong, these songs are far from bad, and when the hooks are there, they just aren't all that impressive. And while I get that the message is the real star of this album, a reflexive and honest look back at how things have evolved and changed since the mid-90s, both in rap and in society at large, the presentation of that message could afford to be just a little bit better. Yet, with all that in mind, LMNO and Evidence have made really a great album with After the Fact, and one that I can recommend without hesitation at all. If you're a fan of underground hip-hop and you have not checked out this guy's material, I highly recommend you give his newest album a serious look. The wordplay is superb, the production is organic as all hell, and the themes and messages of this album are nuanced and articulately realized. This is a thinking man's rap album, and it's definitely worth your time. For me, it's a strong 8 out of 10, and I wish this sort of intelligent rap music with something to say can rise to the top again. But even if it doesn't, LMNO and Evidence have proven that with this album, that the underground will still not disappoint. So yeah, if you like this review, I've got a couple more coming up on the way. The third wave of September albums is going to be pretty heavy for me. It's got MGMT coming out first, and then a series of country albums before hitting up with Kings of Leon and Jason Derulo. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful, or provide any comments on anything else you might want me to review or talk about, or if you want to comment on any elements of my presentation that I might improve, I would be more than grateful for it. Until then, see you next time.